Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you to this penultimate session that marks the close of this inaugural edition of Canto 2023. And it's my incredibly great honor, pleasure, and privilege to be able to be the interlocutor for the next speaker, the main speaker for this panel, and that's Wendy Doniger. Although for audiences worldwide, and particularly audiences and viewers of Canto, she needs absolutely no introduction, purely just by way of protocol, very few quick words, if I may. So Wendy Doniger is the Michi Eliade Distinguished Service Professor Emerita of the History of Religions, and also in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, the Committee on Social Thought, and the College. So on paper, and this is something that you see even on her webpage at the University of Chicago, on paper, her research and teaching interests across her entire life have revolved around two principal areas, Hinduism and mythology. But in reality, if one looks at her entire body of work, of more than 40 books written over half a century, and some of which I've had the great privilege of reading over the past 3 or 4 years and then discussing them online with Wendy. As this entire body of work shows, her expertise really lies across a dazzling spectrum where death, dream, evil, masquerade, and animals of all denominations feature in the keen observation of life as viewed through history, literature, law, gender, psychology, the fine arts, music, dance, and film. And her recent book is a translation of the last books, the concluding part of the Mahabharata. It's called After the Wars, and that is exactly the focus of our discussion this evening. Wendy, good morning, and a very, very warm welcome to Canto 2023.
Thank you, Avik. What a wonderful introduction. It makes me feel tired to think that I did all that, I must say.
Does it ever feel that it's the work of multiple people, that it's not one person, that one is probably talking about 3 or 4 people instead?
It certainly does feel that the early books were not written by me. I don't remember them very well, and I would not have written books like that now. So there were other people. When I started writing, I wasn't who I am now, and my opinions were different. In some ways, I was sharper and brighter. In other ways, I was stupider. So in that sense, I do feel that the books are written by several different people.
Great. Wendy, as you know, the University of Chicago, particularly the center in Delhi, has been the very generous sponsor and partner for this inaugural edition. And I was thinking of a very easy and naturally sort of logical way of beginning this. I mean, we've got the University of Chicago, we've got Wendy Doniger, and we've got the Mahabharata. So if you go back a little bit in time, whenever one talks about the University of Chicago in relation to translation of the epics, the first thing that springs to mind is the Clay edition, right? And the work of scholars such as Van Buitenen, whose translation of the Mahabharata was unfortunately left unfinished by his death. And perhaps that's a good place to begin. Would it be fair? Would it be fair to say that your work, in a way, is a continuation of that, or are there significant differences in approach and methodology between yours and that of Van Buitenen?
Good question. There are differences. I knew Hans van Buitenen. I knew him for years before I came to Chicago. The first few years in Chicago, and then he died. And I have enormous respect for his translations, and I use them all the time. There's no question that those are important and accurate translations. They're the best translations there are for those books of the Mahabharata. But our methods are different. In one way was that he translated the critical edition, the Pune edition of the Mahabharata, which is a strange edition and which leaves out a great deal that I think is important in the Mahabharata. The bad news is they cut out a lot of stuff that I wish they hadn't cut out. The good news is they didn't really cut it out. they put it into the bottom of the page where you reads, he went down this, he went into the forest. Footnote. In the following editions, 10 of them, he went into the forest and he saw 12 naked women and 3 tigers, and he ran around in a circle. And then you go back to the text that he translates. So Hans didn't translate those excerpted bits. He just went straight through it. And because the Mahabharata is a living work and was put together over centuries, you can't do a critical edition. It's not like the European text, the Greek text, where you can find the first thing that some Greek wrote. It's multi-authored right from the start, and it's passed around orally and in various manuscripts for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think it was a real mistake to cut it down to a funny little textual edition based on manuscript. And in my translation, wherever possible, I bring the reader in by adding, noting that it is added out of the critical edition. I put them in italics, adding the parts that they left out. So that's the main way in which I differ from the Van Deutman translation. I also differ in leaving out some, but not all, of the long epithets and flattering words for Your Majesty. There are like 10 or 15,000 ways of saying Your Majesty in Sanskrit, ruler of the earth, son of the gods, and all of that. And it comes down to Your Majesty. And since the whole of the Mahabharata is told to a king in the outermost frame, very often the words Your Majesty are really addressed by the bard singing the entire text to the king hearing the entire text, and not to the person in the paragraph you're translating who's saying, Your Majesty, would you please come over here? So I also leave out some of the parenthetical insertions that I think break up the text for an American or English-speaking reader nowadays. So those are the main ways in which my approach was different from his. Other than that, he's a model that is an honor to follow, and everyone does her own translation. You add certain things and you leave certain things out. There are many words that can be translated in a number of different ways. I decided not to translate the word tapas. I just think it's so important, and you can trust an intelligent reader to learn it and not call it becoming ascetic, which implies, giving up meat or not having women, whereas tapas is actively producing heat. So I don't like to translate it as asceticism. I differ from Hans van Buitenen and that, things like that along the way. What you translate, how you translate it. But basically, he did a great job.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit more, if you will, about the critical edition, the Bhandarkar edition that was brought out in Pune maybe 100 years ago. What is it that amongst scholars worldwide has given it this reputation that it is the most representative? Because I'll tell you where I'm going with this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Bhandarkar edition, with all its exclusions and incisions, has roughly about 75,000, but certainly less than 80,000 shlokas. Whereas right at the end of the Mahabharata itself says, and this comes up in your translation, that there are 100,000 shlokas. So, what about these missing 20, 25,000 shlokas? Where did they go? Are some of these the ones that are included in the Bhandarkar edition, but as exclusions in the appendix? And do we still need this? I know there are multiple questions here, but do we still need this quest for the ultimate version of the Mahabharata, therefore?
Let me answer your last question first. No, the quest for the ultimate Mahabharata is madness. It's not there. What we want is as much Mahabharata as possible, in my humble opinion. You can't have too much of the Mahabharata. Whether there ever were 100,000 verses, that's a very nice round number. No poem was exactly 100,000 verses ever. Whether there was more of it, sure there was more of it. There was a great deal more of it, and we'll never have that. But we have a great deal, 100,000 verses. 75,000 verses is still enough to keep most people busy for a long time. What's interesting to me in translating and considering the other verses is that sometimes one or two manuscripts have something interesting that was left out. Let me give you an example. The story of the death of Krishna, which comes in the 16th book. So let me show you what the critical edition has for it. Krishna realized it. Is that okay, Avik? Can we do that?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Krishna realized it was time to move on to death, and so he obstructed his sensory powers. He lay down and engaged in the ultimate yoga. Then old age came to that place. So old age is a feminine noun that usually means old age. Here it is said to be the name of a hunter. No hunter ever had a feminine noun for a name. So there's something funny about the text anyway. Old age came to that place. He was a fierce hunter hoping to get a wild animal. As Krishna was lying down engaged in yoga, the hunter, old age, mistook him for a wild animal and hastily pierced him with an arrow in the sole of his foot. Achilles' heel, right? This is an Indo-European myth, a one spot. He went up to him intending to lay hold of him, but then the hunter saw that it was a man engaged in yoga, wearing a yellow garment and with several arms. I love that particular, it doesn't say four, just several arms. Realizing that he had made such a bad mistake, he touched the man's 2 feet with his head, his body, revealing his distress. The great-hearted Krishna then consoled him and rose up, filling heaven and earth with his glory. And that's where the text ends, and it's a nice ending. But several manuscripts, 4 or 5 manuscripts that were not included in the critical edition add this really interesting sentence. Remember, the hunter's name is Old Age. Because of old age's remorse, his karma, and his birth, and because he had seen the God of infinite power, when he had left his body, the gods brought him to heaven, where Krishna was worshipped by the hosts of sages. Now that is so interesting that many of the bards of the Mahabharata felt that the man who accidentally killed Krishna was graced even by that negative interaction with him and went to heaven. And I just thought the reader should really know about that. It's in italics, so you know that we know that the Bhandarkar Oriental Institute sages felt that it was not supported by very strong manuscript traditions, but somebody hundreds of years ago thought, I bet he went to heaven, and put that in. And there are just lots of little things like that I feel it's good to know. And so a Sanskritist using the critical edition has it all. You read the text, you read the insertions. But an English-speaking person is limited to what you give her, and I wanted to give her a little more than Hans van Buitenen would have given her in the books that he translated.
So in that particular passage, for example, Van Buitenen did not include that final sentence, that additional sentence.
He didn't. I didn't translate the book that he translated, but had he, in similar places in the first book, where there were other interesting things in other, he never translated anything but the text in the first part. He would have ended filling heaven and earth with his glory.
Right.
All through the book, lots and lots of places where I think you need to see what has been left out of the critical edition.
You just gave the account of the death of Krishna, and there are so many different treatments and discussions or discourses of death in the Mahabharata that itself would take up not just a session but several volumes on a library shelf. Just to go back to the death of Krishna itself, and I'm just quoting from some bits from memory from the translations, so do pardon me if I got this wrong, but purely just that particular death, there is a passage earlier in the Mahabharata, is there not, where Krishna goes and he approaches Gandhari, and Gandhari curses him, saying, you may be Krishna, you may be an immortal, you may be invincible, and you have your special powers, but I am Gandhari, and through my tapas that I have accrued over the several decades and several years, I too have special powers, and I curse thee, that you will be killed, and it will be an ignominious death. And Krishna apparently smiles and says very calmly, but that is something that is already determined, that is already predestined. You're not telling me anything new. In other words, is it fair to say that much of death, no matter the manner of it, could be Suryodhana's death or Karna's death, or the way that Draupadi dies on the way, and we'll come to that presently, or the rest of the brothers except for Yudhishthir. Are all of these meant to be predestined, or is this one particular instance, Krishna's death, which strikes out, which is more the exception than the norm?
I think they're all predestined. And when the curse comes, the curse doesn't make anything happen. The fact that Gandhari has all this power does not make it possible for her to kill Krishna. What it makes it possible for her to do is to tell Krishna how and when he will die. So Krishna is going to die for reasons that have nothing to do with Gandhari or anybody else. It's like a line going like this. And at that point, Gandhari, who has powers, can either give the ball a little push as it rolls on, or reveal to the person exactly how this will happen. So if you commit a sin, and Krishna, of course, commits a number of sins, that's what makes your death. But if someone says, you killed my child, and in fact, that's what Gandhari says. He says, you killed all my sons. It's your fault that all my sons are dead.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because you killed my sons, she says, in 14 years, at this certain place, there will be a big fight and you will die there. So she doesn't make it happen. She tells him exactly when it'll happen. He is cursed to die, but now she says how and when and so forth. So she reveals to him the details. She reveals to the reader of the story, this is after all a text, the details, and she puts a little spin on the billiard ball as it rolls to the end. And in fact, Krishna's death is foreshadowed again. Gandhari's curse is that Krishna's people will die in a drunken party, not in the battle at all. They'll get drunk and kill each other. So the heroes, the good guys, in book 14, which is in book 16, which is one of the books I translated. The heroes, our team, the Yudhishthira and Pandava's people, our team are there, and they start getting drunk, and they accuse one another of having violated the rules of war in their behavior. You killed all these people when they were asleep. You killed a man when he laid down his arms and was unarmed. These are all mistakes. These are all violations. These are all bad things that the good guys did. And they get drunker and drunker. And they start killing each other with clubs that arose in a magical way, which I won't bother with you now. But anyway, these magical pieces of grass turn into clubs as part of the curse. And they club each other to death. And Krishna stands out of it. And the text says, because he knew everything, because he was omniscient, because he knew exactly what had to happen, he took no part in it. And then they kill Krishna's two sons. And Krishna gets mad and picks up a club and kills more people than anybody else. So you have him being God standing by. You have him being a human being, which he is when he's incarnate, and participating in the slaughter, but not dying at this point, then dying in a more controlled way. Himself deciding to do yoga, he's in charge of it. But no, again, someone else comes in. Somebody shoots him in those. He was planning to meditate to himself to death. He lay down and die, and he could have just died like that. But no, this hunter comes and shoots an arrow into him. So Krishna is always going back and forth into being, I am God, I am in charge, I will do yoga, I will die when I want to die, and I will not fight in this fight. And then he's a human being, and he gets mad because he's seen someone kill his son, and there. So it's a wonderful mixture of statements about how death happens, even for a god, in multiple ways, a combination of ways, some of which are foretold in churches, some of which are foretold long before Gandhari is ever on the scene, just Everybody knows how this has to end. And indeed, in the big picture, at the end and the beginning of Yudhishthira, all of the heroes are actually incarnate gods who came down to earth long before the battle began in order to free the earth of her burden. At the end, when everybody is dead, they go back up to heaven and they turn back into gods again. Nobody really died. There's a weird metaphysical case. And before you get to that, people die and they hate dying and their parents miss them and their wives miss them. The humanity of death is vividly portrayed. What it is to be a human being and to die and to see your friends and children die. And then at the end, actually, nothing happened. It was all just a little play that the gods put on, which is not very convincing. It's sort of a coating, a sugar coating, which metaphysically to me does not carry a great density. They did it to make it come out nice in some way. I don't think it's the spirit of the Mahabharata. The spirit of the Mahabharata is that death is.
You're right. That part was strange to the point of being surreal. They all go down into the riverbank, and it's night, and there's moon, and it's almost as if there's somebody who millennia later had some conception of all souls, and used that kind of a construct to resurrect them, albeit temporarily. And while that I'm going to use the word lagna, was still there. Then Vyasa says to the wives, if you really want to join your husbands, go plunge in this holy river, this magical moment, and you'll be united with them forever. So yes, very strange. Talking about strangeness and talking about strange occurrences, one was also struck, and I want to contrast this, if you would permit, with the death of Krishna. And that is the end of Vidura. I'm hesitating to call it death because it's this really strange supernatural, I don't know, transmigration of his soul. Do you want to talk about it and maybe just read out from that passage?
It's such a strange passage. So Vidura, to begin with, is a strange character. He is actually the brother of Yudhishthira, but he doesn't function as his brother. He's born in a very peculiar way. He's really an incarnation of Dharma, just as Yudhishthira is the son of Dharma, which is not the same as an incarnation, but they are both dharmic in their genes and their chromosomes. So Vidura is living a life as a holy man apart from everything, whereas Yudhishthira, of course, is the hero of the Mahabharata. He's had a long, active life, done millions of things, had women, killed people, went to war, and everything like that. Whereas Vidura has always been apart. He's the servant of Yudhishthira. Vidura is a peculiar character altogether, anyway. But he is, in any case, disengaged. He's always been disengaged from life. So when it's time for him to die in book 15, he goes into the forest, and Yudhishthira goes looking for him. And this is what happens. So Yudhishthira comes into the forest. In a lonely, deserted place deep in the forest, Vidura stood leaning on a tree. The intelligent King Yudhishthira recognized that intelligent man only by his general shape, for he was almost entirely wasted away. He'd been fasting for hundreds of years. Standing in front of Vidura, within his hearing, the king said, "I am Yudhishthira." And the other replied with a gesture of understanding. Vidura, deep in meditation, looked right at the king without blinking, yoking his own gaze to the other's gaze. The wise Vidura entered limbs with limbs, placing breaths in breaths, senses in senses. Using the power of yoga, seeming to blaze with the brilliance of the Dharma king, that is, Yudhishthira, Vidura entered the king's body. And then the king saw the body of Vidura just standing right there, its eyes fixed, leaning on the tree, emptied of consciousness. Now, I know no other death like that in the Mahabharata. It's a strange melding of consciousness. Vidura's body is still there. Eventually, Yudhishthira burns it with the funeral rituals. But Yudhishthira himself feels himself doubled in power and strength. He feels that he's not just Yudhishthira, but he's Yudhishthira and Vidura in his essence. And that to me, I can translate the passage. I can't say, and I can see what happened. I can imagine it, but I can't say that I understand it. It's a very mysterious passage, and there are things later on in later Sanskrit literature, but in the Mahabharata, I don't know anything like this. I actually have a painting of it. Um, can I take 1 minute? Oh no. Anyway, yes, I'm going to get the painting. Hang on, I've got the painting.
Okay.
I want to see the painting. Yeah, that's it. That didn't take long.
It better.
It is.
Oh dear.
It was done by Shirley Trieste many years ago for another edition of the Mahabharata of Vidura entering Yudhishthira. I think it's what's the painting. I think it understands it as well as anything I know.
That's strange in so many different ways. So clearly, point one, Vidura was already in a state of near-death samadhi by the time Yudhishthira comes across him in the forest. Point two, and this again going back to the question of teleology, but particularly with regard to death, not just all the occurrences, but death. The very fact that it is Yudhishthira who goes looking for him in the forest when there are so many of these hundreds of other people around means or tends to suggest that Vidura would have chosen in his and that in that dream, like in that samadhi state, for it to be Yudhishthira whose body his soul wanted, or his being wanted to inhabit.
He's already his half brother through their mutual link to the god Dharma. And Vidura has been Yudhishthira's servant, has been close to him all his life. That's the person. If he's going to enter somebody's body, that's the person. But nobody enters anybody else's body. It doesn't happen. That's when you die, your soul goes someplace else. Maybe you become reincarnate, but not reincarnate in someone who's already there. You're reborn in someone who is just an embryo. You don't become reincarnate inside someone else's already 40-year-old body or whatever it is. So that's what makes it strange. The Mahabharata is full of surprises. Just when you think you understand everything, it says, how about this? Try this on for size. You say, whoa. It's full of surprises.
That actually leads me to my next question. When you're talking about what happens to us when we die, we know that there are myriads of ways or means of death that are described right through the Mahabharata, particularly all of the books that deal with the battle, and many of them, and this is something that you've pointed out in earlier discussions and also in your writings, particularly the heroes, many of the main characters die very gruesome, unheroic, tremendously violent deaths. And there are the almost anticlimactic, if I may call it that, deaths of the four Pandavas and that of Draupadi right at the very end before Yudhishthira carries on with the dog following him. But across all of these deaths, is there a common construct? Is there a common thesis in the Mahabharata that emerges, which answers the most fundamental question? What happens to us when we die?
The Mahabharata there's no single answer to anything at all in the Mahabharata. There's always several answers, sometimes contradictory. This is the complexity of the text. The Mahabharata historically is dealing with several different ideas about death. It looks back in many ways to the Indo-European period. It has Indra as king of the gods, and it has a system of death, which is mentioned on numerous occasions and really comes in at the end too, which is the old model of what we know best from Wagner's Valhalla, which is the good warrior, when he dies, goes up to heaven, the Valkyries carry him up. There he is in heaven with beautiful women and lots to eat and drink, and he has a wonderful time. And there's not too much said about people who go to hell. That's sort of the glory. That's what you want. You want to get to Valhalla. And that's part of the Vedic view also. Indra takes you up to heaven, the funeral hymns, beautiful hymns in the Rig Veda about going, the fire, Agni, carries you up through the smoke of the fire. You go to heaven, and there's apsarasas in heaven, dancing girls. It's kind of a man's idea of heaven, if I may say so, kind of a Playboy mansion vision of heaven. Lots to drink, lots of cool water. This is India, after all. And that is still there in the Mahabharata, really. What you get later on in from the time of the Upanishads and right straight through is the idea of transmigration of souls. That depending on how you have behaved, your karma, when you die, your soul leaves your body and does not go to heaven necessarily, but may go to heaven, may go to hell. There's also a hell, Indo-European hell, fiery, underground, all that kind of stuff. Not a good place. You may go to heaven, you may go, or you may be reborn as a Brahmin, as a man, as a woman, as an animal. So the idea of reincarnation is widespread by this time, but you haven't entirely ever, really, not through the medieval period in Hinduism, given the idea of heaven and hell. Stories about people going up to heaven, they meet Indra, they see the Apsarasas going down to hell, meeting people down in hell. Those stories persist. So the idea of heaven and hell is still powerful, and the idea of incarnation is also powerful. And the Mahabharata plays with them so that there's finally a compromise near the end where they say, when you die, if you have mostly good karma and just a little bit of bad karma, you go to hell. This may be counterintuitive. You might think, well, mostly good karma. You go to hell for a little while, but you don't mind it very much because you know that after that, you go to heaven for a long time. And indeed, if you have mostly bad karma, you go to heaven, which is counterintuitive, for a little while, but you don't really enjoy it all that much because you know that after that, you're going to go to hell for a long time. So the Mahabharata has those ideas in it as well. And Yudhishthira goes to heaven and he doesn't find his brothers there. And he says, I don't want this. And they tell him, your brothers are in hell, actually. So he says, okay, I want to go where my brothers are. And that's where he makes that wonderful speech, to hell with kingship, to hell with power, to hell with heroism, to hell with the dharma of kshatriyas. It's a wonderful speech. He's really mad. I've translated to hell the Sanskrit is dick, which used to be translated as phi on it. It means, get it out of here. I hate it. It's hard to translate. Hell is the best I could do. So he goes down to hell and he sees his brothers. And he says, wow, what are you doing here? They say, we're suffering. But when you're here, a cool and perfumed wind comes to us. And when hell stinks, it's one of its qualities, horrible smell. So here we are in this horrid place, and this lovely smell comes from your body and cools us. Stay here. And Yudhishthira says, I'm going to stay here. So it's a kind of generosity, transfer of karma. This is also a post-Vedic, a later Hindu idea, the transfer of karma that comes in the Upanishads. So it's in there. And then the gods say, Yudhishthira, you don't belong here. You're just visiting them. You really belong in heaven. And Yudhishthira says, as long as my brothers are here, I'm going to stay here. Abracadabra, it was a dream. There were no brothers in hell. Yudhishthira wasn't in hell. It was just a vision. It vanishes. Your brothers are in heaven, so forth. So what is this? It was just a dream. I mean, then they say years ago, Yudhishthira told one tiny lie when they were trying to get a very powerful warrior not to play. They said, Ashwatthama is dead. And his son's name was Ashwatthama. And that was a lie. Yudhishthira had to say, because everybody knew Yudhishthira didn't lie. But he said, Ashwatthama is dead. And then this great warrior said, oh my God, and he didn't fight him. And the good guys won the fight. Whereas actually, there was an elephant named Ashwatthama. And what Yudhishthira really said was, Ashwatthama, the elephant, is dead. So he sort of lied and didn't lie. So the gods say at the ending, and remember that thing with the elephant? Well, you sort of went to hell and sort of didn't go to hell because you sort of lied and sort of didn't lie, and really you're in heaven. That's a real mess of a plot. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's the Mahabharata trying to get everything in at once. You do go to hell, but Yudhishthira doesn't go to hell, but he sort of went to hell. And really, he's in heaven because he goes to heaven. And actually, he isn't a human being at all. He's really the god Dharma. So he never really was on earth. So at the end, all these um, screens, these curtains are pulled away, pulled away, pulled away metaphysically. And what it is different scribes over the centuries adding their own 2 cents to the Mahabharata to try to make sense of everything. It's not a single authored work. Vyasa did not actually write the whole of the Mahabharata. Hundreds of people did. So at the end, they try to get everything but the kitchen sink into it. And it's a wonderful mess of an ending. Everything you could possibly think of to explain death is there at some point in book 18 of the Mahabharata. And narratively, it's kind of a mess, but it's great fun to read. And it's also enormously rich. You could just see these guys had so many ideas, they could hardly get them onto paper fast enough. They didn't get them onto paper. They were saying them orally. And later on, other guys wrote them down. So when you ask me what the Mahabharata thinks about death, I say, wait, how much time have you got?
When you were talking about that part, particularly when the abracadabra moment happens, and it was all really a dream, it was all really an illusion, it was all really a game, it was play. One some of the texts that came to mind are not the Mahabharata, but the texts written between the 1940s and 50s, and particularly reminded of Hermann Hesse, for example, what happens at the end of Steppenwolf or Journey to the East, where all of this happens, and then there's the realization, was it all a dream? Was it all a trance? It just struck me. But going back to what you were saying earlier, that there seems to this...
It's an old trick and it's a new trick. They used it in American television. There was a series called Dallas. And at the last minute, one of the actors either died or left the show. And they had an unfinished sequence and they reran it as a dream that someone had dreamed after this guy had died. So it was used in American television in the 50s, I think.
Going back to what you were talking about, my destiny is shaped by this incredibly complicated mathematics, this bookkeeping, this debit and credit entries, if you will, of virtues and sins, of what we have done. That is fascinating.
There's another It Was a Dream sequence. We have time to talk about another It Was a Dream sequence that's significant in the Mahabharata. We talk about one? About the dog, Yudhishthira and the dog?
So let's talk about, yes, animals in the Mahabharata. And I'm just mindful of the time, so we'll probably not talk about horses, because after all, horses don't really feature in the last books of the Mahabharata, in the concluding part, but the dog is central to it. Do you want to tell the story of the dog and Yudhishthira as they go up to heaven, and then
I'll tell it
deconstruct
briefly.
it?
I'll tell briefly. And mind you, it is another example of the Mahabharata being inconsistent when it can't solve a problem in the history of religions. So the Pandavas are going to heaven, and basically one by one they fall behind, and only Yudhishthira is there. And Yudhishthira is alone except for a dog that's been following him up the mountain all this time. He gets to the gates of heaven, and Indra says, Yudhishthira, welcome, come into heaven. And Yudhishthira says, thank you very much. And I'll just bring this dog with me. And Indra says, there are no dogs allowed in heaven. Dogs are unclean. He's speaking now like a Hindu. They lick the sacrificial elements. Hindus, dogs are unclean and so forth. You can't bring the dog in. And Yudhishthira says, this dog is my bhakta. Didn't yet mean what it came to mean in Hinduism. Simply meant it's what dogs do. He's devoted to me. And there are rules, and he quotes the rules in law books, laws of Manu and so forth, that if you turn away someone who is your bhakta, it's the equivalent of killing a Brahmin or something, really the most terrible thing you could think of. I won't go to heaven without this dog. And it's a whole philosophy of bhakti, really. It's not bhakti yet like Krishna and Radha, but it is the idea of personal devotion as opposed to the idea of ritual purity, which is Vedic and which is what Indra is going by, no dogs. And Yudhishthira finally says, well, that's it then. I'm not going to go to heaven. He turns away. And the dog turns out to be Dharma. Yudhishthira's father, incarnate as a dog, which is like saying for a Jew that Jehovah was incarnate in a pig. It's an extraordinary thing to say that Dharma became a dog. And Dharma says this was just a test. It was the last of several tests. You're a good guy. You can go to heaven. So, on the one hand, you have the philosophy of the Vedic ritualism, which is no dogs, and you have a new philosophy coming up now, this idea of bhakti. And you can't put them together. Either you do or don't have dogs in heaven. And and because the Mahabharata cannot solve that problem, it says it was a dream. There was really no dog, no problem. You can go to heaven, Yudhishthira, without betraying a bhakta because there was no bhakta. So you can see the Mahabharata posing itself this moral problem of the clash of two religions incarnate in the idea of a dog, and then basically copping out and saying we can't solve this. We're going to say it's a dream, just as they really couldn't solve what Yudhishthira was doing in hell, and so they said that was a dream. It's a wonderful idea of the Mahabharata trying to grow, trying to change, and being unable yet to make the jumps that later in the religious texts would make, which is indeed the dog goes to heaven and Vedic ritual. Can you hear him? There's the dog. The dog goes to heaven and Vedic ritualism doesn't count. So that's a wonderful moral moment. It's a wonderful animal moment as well, Yudhishthira and his dog.
But it still leaves the basic question moot, doesn't it? Why in the formulation is it the form? Is it the shape of a dog that Dharma has to inhabit? After all, we're talking about very cold upper reaches of the mountains of the Himalayas. I mean, surely a snow leopard would be not out of place. And I'm just speculating. Why a dog? Which in the Hindu canon, unlike a horse, the horse of the Ashwamedha would probably be admitted into heaven.
The horse is the Brahmin Kshatriya animal. The dog is an untouchable. The untouchables are often called shwapakas, people who cook and eat dogs. So the dog is dealing with this is the beginning of caste revolution. This is the beginning of challenges to caste. And the Mahabharata begins with a dog. Janamaja is beginning to give a big sacrifice. And Sarameya, these are the dogs that belong, the children of the bitch Sarama. Back to my dog needs to come in, excuse me, appropriately. I shut him out when I went to get the painting. Okay, here he is. So we're going to tell the story of the bitch Sarama. We're going to tell it. There he is. There he is. All right.
He must be psychic. He absolutely must be
He
psychic.
knew what I was talking
Because he
about.
just mentioned the dog and he just starts scratching on the door and barking.
So in the Rig Veda, Sarama, we're not caste system yet in the Rig Veda. Sarma is the bitch of Indra. She's his hunting dog and she saves his life on several occasions. Dogs are just fine in the Rig Veda. Mahabharata, you're already getting the caste system. And Sarama's sons, the Sarameyas, come to Janameja's sacrifice and they drive them out with stones. And the dogs go back to their mother and say what happened. And she curses Janamejaya to have serious problems with animals. And that's when Janamejaya's problem with snakes begins. And so the whole Mahabharata really, it's that Janamejaya's sacrifice that the Mahabharata is recited. The Mahabharata begins with the wrongful, the unethical mistreatment of dogs, and it ends with the challenge to the ethical treatment of dogs. So dogs are important. They frame it in that sense, and they pose they're clues, they're signs that come up to us that the Mahabharata is dealing with moral questions it cannot yet answer. And that will only be answered in later centuries in more developed texts of ethics and of ritualism. And finally, the challenge to caste that comes with bhakti, real bhakti, in the medieval period. It all begins in the Mahabharata. Everything is in the Mahabharata. Just as it says, everything is here, it's right. Everything is here. That's a true statement.
I mean, having read, and I'm talking to, just for the viewers, I'm talking to Wendy, who if I'm not mistaken, by the time she was 16, had gone through all the Western classics, the epics of the West, the Greeks in the original Greek, the Latin epics in the original Latin, and having consumed and exhausted all of them, turned her gaze eastward, and that is where she was directed to Kalidasa, if I'm not mistaken, at the age of 17. Kumarasambham, and that began this lifelong love affair with the Indian Sanskrit epics, etc. Having read so much of world literature, in particular the classics, in particular the ancient epics, is that assertion, is that incredibly proud assertion something that you agree with, that the essence of life, as you have seen it, as you know it to be, is really contained in the Mahabharata, and whatever is not there is not to be found in our universe, at least in this earthly universe? Is that something you agree with?
I think so. I think there's much more in the Mahabharata than there is in Homer. I think the Odyssey and the Iliad, for one thing, they're shorter books. They're also much more focused books. Each tells a story. There are little side stories, but there's a basic line. They are limited. They have wonderful things in them, and I love them dearly. But they are limited. The Mahabharata is much messier, much more promiscuous. It has different kinds of literature in it. It covers centuries of composition, whereas the Greek epics were composed over a much shorter period of time, if not by one author, but just one or two authors. The Mahabharata is like the Encyclopedia Britannica in a way. It tries to put every single thing into it that there is. It claims to do so, and I think it probably does. I'm not much of a philosopher, and I don't know. There is philosophy in the Mahabharata, but I don't think it's nearly as developed as later Indian philosophy. And there is poetry in the Mahabharata, but it's not as beautiful as much later poetry. It's not that it's the only book you ever have to read. But I think there's not a single human question that the Mahabharata doesn't tackle. A single ethical question, a single moral question, a single dramatic question, birth, death, life, marriage, war, money, power, animals. There's no important human topic about life on the planet Earth, and perhaps in hell and heaven, who knows how much they know about that, that the Mahabharata doesn't broach, and intelligence. It has its limits. It has its beliefs of what human beings can do, which are much more limited than what we now think human beings can do, I think. There are women in the Mahabharata, but not as many as there are in the world. And there are low caste people in the Mahabharata, but not as many as there are in the world. So it has its boundaries. But I do think it talks about everything that's important in human life. And it's right about a lot of it. I disagree with its views on some subjects, but they're always intelligent, and they're always interesting. Always interesting.
Wendy, we're coming towards the end of our session, and perhaps a very apt way to end it before we take a question or two would be to talk about the way that the Mahabharata itself, the epic itself, ends. I'll give you a quick anecdote, if I may, because I'm going to talk about somebody you and I both like, a mutual friend, the poet and novelist Amit Chaudhary. Back in 2020, when there wasn't very much to do, all of us were stuck indoors and we were just having conversations about everything and, the meaning of life, as Douglas Adams would have called it. And we were talking about creative reimaginings of the basic narrative structure. And Amit told me, you know what, Avik, just once in my life before I'm done, I want to write a book which is full of paragraphs, and each of these paragraphs could be the beginning of a book. And when one reads, and there's something, if you see the obverse of it, if you see the ending of the Mahabharata, and this is something that you have remarked as well in your annotation, that it almost seems as if there are multiple endings and sub-endings and different variations of endings as if it was a book of endings with each of its distinct, different possibilities. Do you want to talk about the way that it ends, and possibly the way that, obviously we're talking about multiple authorship, the poets would have finally been able to bring it to conclusion and fruition?
Well, there are these multiple endings, almost like codas. There are multiple blessings. There are multiple statements about what you get if you read the Mahabharata. There are claims for how wonderful the Mahabharata is. Um, if you read it, a woman will have a strong child, and a man will be a great warrior, or whatever it is. All these ideas, and the famous statement. Um, um, there are some things, whatever is not in this, some things in this book are also found elsewhere, but nothing that is found elsewhere is not in this book. So its claim is really to be coterminous with the world, with the human world. And then there are the blessings that are brought to you if you recite it here and if you recite it there. If you kill a Brahmin in the morning and say the Mahabharata at night, you're sinless. That's one of the great claims of it. It projects itself into the world as a tool by which one can live. And indeed, since so much of it is devoted to ethics, it is a tool to live in the world. Um, the project I'm working on now, having done these 4 last books, I've gone back to books 12, 13, and 14, and right before the books I did, where there are miscellaneous stories that have nothing to do with the main plot, nothing to do with the Pandavas and the battle. A king needs to have some money, and he says to a Brahmin, "How am I going to get this money?" And the Brahmin says, "Well, you can get it the way Maruta got it." And the king says, "Who was Maruta? And how did he get his money?" And therefore, an entirely irrelevant story is told. And there are about 150 of these stories scattered through the last books of the Mahabharata, almost all with a moral or ethical point. Stories about kings, stories about gods, how the world was created, how the jackal fooled the lion, how the mouse fooled the cat, um, a man who fed his entire family on one husk of rice. Uh, I don't know yet what the order is, but I'm translating these stories. I'm going to try to find out. They're all messed up. They're all hidden. They're never cited together. People skip them in translations because they're not about the story. So I'm going to find out a lot more about the Mahabharata than I know now, and I look forward to it. There's more to come.
Of course, man, when those books come, we shall learn more and we shall have you back again. Again. I know we've almost come right to the end in terms of time, but uh, maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, the Mahabharata contains certain elements or characters that are gender neutral, like old age that you mentioned before, or yara, which is but a metaphor for aging and death. You think that the epic becomes more gendered in translation? Uh, there is another instance in the last book which says that when the Pandavas were going somewhere, they were attacked by bandits, and the great hero Arjun couldn't even lift his bow. So that they were attacked by Yara. So Yara comes in different phases. So what's your opinion on that?
That's a good question. The great gender bending story in the Mahabharata is the story of Amba, who's reborn as Shikandin. She's reborn as a man. It's a wonderful feminist story. She's so badly treated as a woman in various ways. They were just awful. But she kills herself. And as she goes into the fire, she says, "I want to be born as a man." So she is not really reborn as a man. She's reborn as a woman whose parents pretend he's a boy for their own reasons, and who grows up and pretends to be a man and goes into battle and so forth. So she's an important character. Shikandin. She's related to Draupadi. He or she. She's really a doubly sexed person who has female feelings, female memory, male attitude, and so forth. So I think that's the great contribution to the idea of gender bending and blending in the Mahabharata is that story. Um, then there are these interesting gender mistakes. As you say, Jara is a feminine noun, and it's spelled with a long A in the Mahabharata. You can change a feminine noun into a male noun by making the final long A into a short A. They could have called him Jara with a short A, but they called him Jara. So he's a female person who's referred to as the hunter, which is a male noun. So there's androgyny in this important scene of the killing of Krishna. There's androgyny in the character of Shikandan, who plays a key role in the Mahabharata in the battle books. Amba, she's right there when the heroes are born. Uh, when Pandava, when Pandu and Yudhishthira are born, Amba's part of the story of the birth of the hero. She's not a peripheral character at all. So those are two major passages in the Mahabharata about gender bending and gender ambiguity. There's also the masculine qualities of Draupadi, who's one tough woman and is often accused of being too masculine in her. She's the one who saves the Pandavas in various ways. I think that's less of a case you can make for that than that she's just a woman who stands up for women's rights, which is also interesting in several hundred years BCE and so forth. So I think that's where the gender bending comes in the great important story of Amba and Shikandan, and in this ambiguity that you correctly noted in the story of Krishna. Not a lot else that I can see in it.
My question is, any epic, especially when we have deep connection to any religion, tend to foster the creation of various subplots or religious community-based additions or amendments along with the main text. This is true in Mahabharata as well. It is hard to reconcile all these with the so-called main version of Mahabharata. However, these variations are also very important for the explanation of the scope and possibilities of the main text, and they are very important to for the understanding of the reflection of ethics and values and their change over time. As a result, the Mahabharata make as a result, the Mahabharata may speak to an Indian person, despite the varied perspective that even Indian may hold. It much more pronounced manner that someone who is unfamiliar with the cultural connotations that is with the informed text. It is possible to hold on to this essence in translation. Is it possible? Is there any need for it at all? But if so, how could it be made possible?
Big question. Um, I think the fact that the Mahabharata has so many different communities in it and has so many different, often contradictory religious ideas in it, I just pointed out too, the very different attitudes toward caste right inside the text itself, that it is, that's why it has generated so many throughout history retellings of itself by different communities. Um, in a series that I published in America, the Sunni series, we published last year a wonderful book called Many Mahabharatas, which was edited by Nell Hawley, my last PhD student, my 85th PhD student, which talks about all the ways that the issues that you raised there, the different voices, the different communities, gave birth to other Mahabharatas, Sanskrit plays and Sanskrit retellings, then tellings in Marathi retellings and Tamil retellings and so forth, modern retellings, Hollywood, Bollywood movies of the Mahabharata, all sorts of ways, folk tales of the Mahabharata. My wonderful colleague Alf Hiltebeitel died a few days ago, a wonderful man. And he wrote, what was it called? The Cult of Draupadi, and several other books about how Draupadi was developed as a goddess in South India, and the stories were retold, and how they were retold by Muslims as well as by Hindus. Alf did a wonderful job on developing, the first one really, to develop the idea of the retellings of the Mahabharata by people who took some little thing in it that they saw, like the part you talked about, the ambiguous gender of Jada, or Shikandin, more obvious, and went with it in all different directions. So this many Mahabharatas is really almost like a key to the many Mahabharatas. It's a good place to begin, but there are many contemporary retellings. The Palace of Illusions is one of my favorite retellings about Shikandin and Draupadi and so forth. So yes, these other hints of alternative views within the Mahabharata, which are developed in Sanskrit first, and then in all the regional languages of India, and then finally in English. And much has been written about them because it is interesting and it is important. And the most recent one that I know of is last year's book, Many Mahabharatas, edited by Nell Hawley. But it's a very important thing. It was richer than the Ramayana in that way. The Ramayana has been more useful as a tool of political domination. Rama killed Ravana just like I, whoever I am, I'm going to kill you, and so forth. So there are many retellings of the Ramayana, not all of which are about political domination, but some of which are. And they're beautiful ones. There's the common Ramayana and so forth. But the Mahabharata has been more miscellaneous in its sociological spread, in its caste spread. It's been retold in languages by people who couldn't read at all in any language, and it's reached their hearts as well. So in that sense, it's a truly all-encompassing text.
Thank you for that, Wendy. And this is something that we were also remarking on. When you read poems or when you read collections, almost in a silo, you don't have necessarily a pattern, but something that we have seen across close to 30 events and across 4 days of the festival is the urge, the need, the palpable need for modern poets, be that in India, and or be that in the US poets such as Vijay Seshadri, to go back to stories of the epics, or someone like Daljit Nagara to go back to the stories of the epics, to the Ramayana, to the Mahabharata, and retell them over and over and over again. Possibly because, as you discussed earlier, they're not just important, they're not just immortal, eternal, but they talk about everything in a way that constitutes the human condition, that constitutes life, which is why we return to them
Yes.
so many times. Wendy, this has been an absolute pleasure, a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with you yet again. Thank you very much for being a part of this inaugural edition of Canto 2023, and we hope to have you back for many future sessions.
I'm honored to be asked, and it was lots of fun talking with you, Avik. Really, it was.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.